we have got to celebrate the maestro, Diego, the newest doctorate of music, first ever from Columbia, the Jacobs School. Congratulations on successfully defending, Diego. It's a big deal. Big deal. Yeah. That's awesome. Hopefully we can celebrate properly. Hopefully you already started that. Other little thing is we finally got the copies, guys, of Lynn's Uncommon Life. It took an uncommonly long time. And Emily deserves so much. And she's not here right now, but I'll relay this again to her. So much accolades for making this happen. Illustrator was fantastic to work with. We have copies and we're going to do a little impromptu signing if anybody would like a copy of it afterward. Okay. So we'll just do that back there. But for now, we're going to properly introduce our distinguished speaker for today, who needs no introduction because long-time workshopper. But Edu, thanks so much for doing this for us and for being here to make this happen.
Pleasure. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see everyone and our attendees online, and particularly our colleague, long-term workshopper, Professor Daniel DeCaro. He's an associate professor in psychological science at the University of Toledo, and the director of the Social Decision Making and Sustainability Lab. Right? Wonderful name for a lab. Daniel is, really well known in the workshop. He spent 3 years here as a postdoctoral researcher between 2010 and 13. Had several projects with colleagues and with Lean, one of which I think we're talking today just concluded recently, right? Yeah. We started at that time. Just briefly, I think you're talking, it relates to 2 of your NSF projects. We have 2 really interesting NSF projects, one on social motivation and cooperative effects of communication, enforcement and participatory decision-making in resource dilemma. Right? You're, I think, concluding this one this year.
Yeah, it just ended in January.
Yeah, congratulations. And one that it just concluded and maybe has some to do with this presentation as well. Legal design principles of government-supported adaptation. Designing effective decentralization programs in cities in which vital water social ecological systems. Wonderful projects. So welcome, Daniel. His paper states reinforced co-production of community-governed green space in racially marginalized urban neighborhoods. Case study of Chicago. Welcome, great.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. I always love to be here. It's good to see everybody as well. Can I ask, how much time do I have? I want to set a timer, make sure I don't go over it.
We try just 20 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
Thereabouts.
That's what I planned for, 20.
Oh, look at you.
So that's
well
good.
done. Okay.
Okay, so a lot of ground to cover. I'm only going to be able to hit some highlights, and then hopefully in the Q&A and discussion, we can get into like really cool details.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and dive straight into the focal dilemma. Most US cities are racially segregated, as you know, and they fail to deliver on a lot of public goods, especially in marginalized neighborhoods. And green spaces, unfortunately, is just another one of those things. There are many factors that have contributed to this. So, for example, discriminatory politics, economic processes. There's a lot of disinvestment and decline in these neighborhoods, resulting in a lot of vacant lots with lots of debt, low tax revenue from concentrated poverty. And one of the things that's really tricky here is a lot of landowners and property laws that are converging, and other types of laws converging on this dilemma in a super fragmented governance network usually. This makes it very challenging for these actors to resolve the dilemma. A lot of times they really struggle to do it on the government side and non-government, if you want to use that terminology. Okay, so it starts to get you to think about adaptive and transformative capacity for governance and trying to understand how do people design more adaptive governance systems to resolve these sort of things. So we might look to forms of adaptive capacity. So what are institutional characteristics that make actors, collective action processes, and their governance systems more adaptive? And for that, we need to find ways to start to really define and evaluate adaptive capacity. I'm going to make an inference here to like design principles. We'll see talking about that here in a bit. And then government, what roles should various governments play vis-a-vis other actors? So needing to understand various types of co-production in a very sophisticated way. Also need to understand how configurations of actors and unique context, etc., work together and constrain or change the manifestation of design principles and processes. So the way that I've started to come at this is through early concept of state reinforced self-governance that I kind of found in Vincent's work, thinking of a federal system as a system for societal adaptation through societal self-governance. And there's this really cool quote that I always like to share with this. It says, if a federal system of government entails governments, I can't see part of it because that thing.
We can fix that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay. Entails a great multitude of governments, each organized on principles of self-government. We might view such an arrangement as constituting a self-governing society where society governs itself for itself. So it's a very complex form of self-governance. And even says federalism is a method for solving problems. The adaptive capacity comes from this and other things built into these systems. So Sarkar in 2013 coined this term state reinforced self-governance. And as I've started to think about it, I realized what he was saying there was that governments can use their administrative, legislative, regulatory, fiscal powers to either enable or constrain these capacities. And I've been working to kind of formalize this. So what are kind of things that state might do? It can create new actors. It can create new collective action processes, or at least create conditions for them to emerge, enabling them or constraining them. It can create formal rules and processes for societal cooperation, informal norms to back that up or not. And it can codify things that are coming from the bottom up, emergent forms of self-governance. It can institutionalize those, it can empower them, or it can constrain those. And of course, classic things like regulatory activities. Okay, so like I said, I've been working on formalizing this into a broader framework. This framework has 5 major components. I'll only be able to show some of it today. So refined conceptualization of the state, like I was just talking about there, plus more. Design principles that I mentioned before, and thinking of those as these like formal, informal foundations or the base elements of adaptive capacities built into institutions. So state reinforcement, which I started working on in 2017, and I'll talk about today. And then Lynn's design principles, which I'm conceptualizing here as capacity for multi-actor cooperation, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. We have a classification system for classifying different institutional configurations in terms of capacity based off of 3 basic design principles, which I won't get into today, and then an updated SES framework, which is really a different way to represent visually what's going on. And you'll see why, to make the state and non-state a little bit easier to parse. And then finally, humanistic rational choice theory, a behavioral theory of constitutional cooperative decision-making to talk about all this stuff. How does it emerge from human behavior? Okay, so those are the components. Now, here are the design principles that I'm working with at this moment. I don't expect you to read these. The gist is on the bottom, of course, Lynn's design principles manifest in a different form. So you're familiar with those. So up at the top, thinking about formal authority, responsibility, etc., assigned in law, that grants certain powers for decision-making, different operational authorities to carry out various functions and act on those decisions, formal responsibilities to perform particular functions, operational resources, so thinking about ways in which governments support external funding, external resources, but also that certain actors have internal capacities, self-sufficiency. Those need to be balanced, or the balance matters at least. And then mechanisms of flexibility. The gist here is thinking about, do the appropriate actors have the right capacities to do the thing they need to do? That's basically the gist of it. And what would those capacities be? And then thinking, okay, do they have the right capacities for cooperation? And there's even state reinforcement of that. So think, for example, formal authority to share decision-making, formal responsibility to share decision-making, state reinforcement of that, and then de facto. So that's the gist of those. And you'll see these more throughout there. Okay, so what are the capacities needed for the dilemma that I'm talking about? And you're going to see how complex this is and why there's a complex solution. Okay, so in this complex governance network, you need some collective collections of actors with various capacities somehow assigned across them. But at the end of the day, all the things need to be met, or most of them. So you need some capacity to govern the dilemma. You need to be able to make high-level decisions about the rules of the game, constitutional decision-making and rulemaking. You need to be able to implement and operate within those rules and come up with practices, regulate actors' behavior, and you ideally would have a fiscally viable solution. Okay. Got ahead of myself. Land acquisition, extremely important if you're going to try to provide land for community green space. So just as some examples, you need some formal authority to acquire the land. You also need some formal authority to protect it long-term so that communities can invest their time and energy to self-governance. Okay, so in terms of land management, for example, we may want to or may need to transfer the rights and responsibility of the management to some actor, obviously. In this case, I'll be talking about communities getting that. And then their behavior needs to be regulated. Are they using these green spaces properly? Are they for public interest and that kind of thing? So there's a lot of stuff these actors need to solve all at once to do this well. And then another aspect is these various actors, especially if they're central to the solution, they need capacity for self-governance. Because the more self-governance they have on average, and there's context dependency here, but it increases their generalized capacity to do all this stuff, essentially. So thinking about, do the actors have the right attributes to play this game, essentially? So again, capacity for self-governance as capacity for adaptation. Okay, so to my actual case, this is a really interesting case. It's pretty well known to be a really successful solution to the problem, even internationally, as a potential model. It centers around a nonprofit land trust called NeighborSpace in Chicago. And so just to give you a highlight, so in 2018 and even today, the park score here estimates that 98% of Chicago's population is within a 10-minute walk of some sort of recreational / green space area. When the case started, when NeighborSpace emerged back in 1996-ish, 93, it was about 30% of the population. Wow. Okay, so this is a snag from their website, and you can see up here their mission: only nonprofit urban land trust in Chicago that preserves and sustains gardens on behalf of dedicated community groups. We'll go into more of that in a minute. Here's a map of the green spaces that were existing at the time of the study. It's roughly 115. It's like 120 now-ish. And when they first started, it was 8 of them. Okay. Okay, so this is the updated SES sort of layout that I was talking about before. So I'm going to walk you through the case here. And what's going to happen is it's operationalizing what we needed to code in terms of state reinforcement and policies and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so a lot going on. So NeighborSpace was established, this nonprofit, through an intergovernmental agreement between 3 city actors: the city of Chicago / mayor's office, essentially, the Chicago Park District, and the Forest Preserve District of Cook County, I think. Yeah. And those were 3 entities that were very responsible for, in that case, lack of provision of these green spaces. And what happened was there was a series of civil lawsuits and then a federal lawsuit through the Department of Justice that resulted in a consent decree around 1998 or 1983-ish, somewhere around there, and culminating in like 1992-ish. That basically said, okay, you all are responsible for this alleged discriminatory provision of green space. There weren't enough green spaces in these neighborhoods. And so you need to come up with some solution. That triggered a several-year self-study, which resulted in the city space plan. When they said, okay, sure enough, we are not actually providing green space equitably to these neighborhoods. We have a fragmented network. If we look at each of our own capacities in this governance network, we don't have enough to do this because these green spaces are spread out all over the place, and we are designed for large parks right now. Our zoning laws aren't compatible, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that emerged out of that was saying we need to cooperate more. In order to do it, we need to create a nonprofit land trust organization called NeighborSpace. So when NeighborSpace was created, I don't know if this is the pointer or not. Whoops. Okay. I think I'll just use my hand. I don't know how to make the little, do you know how to make the little pointer go?
I think it's this red one, right?
Okay, thank you.
It's kind of hard to see on the screen.
Oh, yeah, you're right. It is hard to see. Okay, I'm just going to use the analog method. So, this is NeighborSpace, right? It has a board of directors. That board of directors, per the intergovernmental agreement, has representation by the city appointed by the mayor, the park district and the forest preserve district, and aldermen to represent community interests of the ward system, and then representation like president, executive director from the board. It serves as the constitutional decision-making body for the cooperative partnership, okay? The collective action process that yields the public good provisioning of the governance system through this agreement, okay? Here we've got the NeighborSpace staff, and one of the things that's on the staff is a stewardship coordinator for the green spaces. What it is responsible for is acquiring eligible green space that they help coordinate through this body, where they are and all that kind of stuff. And it is paired with local communities. The way that they devolve the community-based management to the communities is through a formal partnership agreement with each community. It's like a 1 or 2 year process. They have to say, we have 3 people who are going to be long-term leaders. We have to have a community organization sponsor to work with us. We have to have at least 10 stakeholders and a management plan. This goes through approvals. If their agreement goes through, they become responsible for governing the green space, and NeighborSpace will not take a green space unless this exists. Okay, so that's that formalization there. And then thinking about at federal, state, local, etc., what laws are sort of granting capacities to these actors and collective action processes to do this stuff. Okay. So now to the case study. So our data collection period was 2017 to 2020. We got lots of policy documents that we felt were really constitutionally central to this process. We got Internal Revenue Code governing nonprofit organizations and tax exempt corporations. We've got the Illinois Nonprofit Corporation Act and Land Trust Acts. And then local city, that intergovernmental agreement was an actual ordinance that formed it and established NeighborSpace for a minimum of 20 years. It was just renewed. And then NeighborSpace's bylaws. Again, what we're looking for here are those capacities I was talking about before, authorities, etc. And then lots of other stuff for background information. We did interviews, and we were focused on these interviews, not on the green spaces, but on the people responsible for the partnership itself, that level. There's been a lot of research on the community level. Okay, so in NeighborSpace, we interviewed the president at the time, the executive director, and the stewardship coordinator. Decades of experience in NeighborSpace at this point and in the green spaces. And then representatives for each of the 3 city partners, park district, etc., and an alderman that was serving at the time. And our goal with that was to look at essentially rules, de jure rules in paper versus in practice, and see, is there a parity here? Are there disconnections, confirmatory evidence, disconfirmatory? And then census tract data to determine, are these green spaces actually serving marginalized communities? The gist is yes, just to get that out of the way. Okay, so I propose to do a lot of stuff. So I'm going to show you some of the worksheets that we actually use to do this, because I think that helps clarify a lot. And then I can show you a little bit of the results involved. All right, now the question is, can I get it to share? I'm trying to figure out how to switch it to share to my other stuff.
Your other screen?
Share window. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe let me share.
Thank you. Okay, can we go to this one?
This one? Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so here's an actual snapshot or actual file from our coding sheet. We operationally defined all these design principles. We went through the documents to look for various things I'll talk to you about, but so this is design principle for authority, decision-making authority. We broke it down into constitutional decision-making authority, operational, generally speaking, fiscally, collective choice rules, and representation, because these things constrain these things. If you don't have proper representation on the board by various actors, you get different levels of true authority, essentially, for example. So in any case, what we did is we went through those documents. So here's Internal Revenue Code, here's a nonprofit code. We took out excerpts that matched up with these definitions, labeled them, organized them. We did that for all those things here. As you can see, you have responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's our first step, is saying, okay, what's in the laws here that are pertinent to these things we were talking about before, such as land acquisition authority, authority to make decisions in your organization, authority to make decisions about the dilemma. Okay, could you help me get that other one? I didn't see how you did that. Thank you.
So this guy?
This one. Okay. So then comes an evaluation step. Okay, we collected all these statements that are pertinent to these design principles. We need to think, okay, what way are they manifested in this situation? And are they adequate and are they sufficient and appropriate for this context to essentially embody the principle, to give the actor sufficient amount of that principle? So the way that we did this is we have a sub sheet for each of these components that I showed you earlier. That was basically operational definition. So if I were to go to constitutional decision-making, for example, here, we collected all the statements that have to do with, for example, constitutive capacity to form and incorporate this neighbor space in the first place. That's a type of authority, constitutive authority. Authority to define and decide your organizational type, mission, rights, powers, etc. It's kind of a constitutional decision-making thing. Constitutional decision-making, rule-making powers, capacity, or in terms of collective choice rules for voting rights, etc. Took those, thought about them conceptually, started to get all the excerpts lined up here, labeled with their sections, then take them back to that summary sheet, consolidated, and say, okay, what did we find that tells us about decisions about its fundamental social contract, organizational makeup, mission, etc., and basically summarized. Here's what we see for each of these things. And again, this is not going to be possible for you to like see very well, but for example, here, based off our summary of all those things I just collected over here, Illinois Nonprofit Act, Open Land Trust Act, etc., authorize NeighborSpace as a nonprofit land trust to make constitutional decisions regarding land acquisition and management of the eligible green spaces per its agreement, essentially, etc. And then interviews, what did they say about that? Did it correspond or not? We then translated that into, okay, to what extent are we confident that this design principle has been met sufficiently? And we did that as, this is meant to be descriptive, not strongly quantitative, but it is to lead into quantitative down the road. But anyway, 2 being, okay, based off of the de jure evidence and the interview data, we are very confident that this capacity exists. 1 being like, okay, we're not 100% confident. It seems to be there. 0 is it seems mixed or it wasn't brought up. And then of course, confident it's definitely not there, etc. Okay, almost out of time, but I've got enough to do it. Okay, could you get me back to the actual talk?
Happy.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Okay, that was me. Okay, so here's a summary of some of the evidence. There's no way I can get into all the details. I think Q&A, but in any case, what is NeighborSpace's capacity for its own self-governance? The gist is, so just because I want to get in details of other things, is that if you think about it, the whole purpose of making these laws was to create self-governing entities, these units of democracy, so that they would be able to do lots of public goods. So when you look at it, we decided, okay, based off everything we saw, they're given very strong constitutive powers, etc., and commensurate responsibilities, which we can talk about what those are later. So this one's probably not all that surprising. It's like, okay, well, they were designed for that in the first place, but that's an important thing to know, because in a case that I'm looking at in Louisville that uses a cooperative extension service, they do not have these capacities, not nearly as robustly. Okay, so let me just do this and then I'll stop and turn it over to you all. This is actually where I plan to stop. Okay, so going back to those capacities, I said, okay, people need to do these, actors need to do these things to solve this dilemma. Okay, so what about capacity for NeighborSpace through its board and its administrative body to make constitutional decisions regarding this? Well, if you look at the Nonprofit Act, you look at the intergovernmental agreement, it's authorizing them to make decisions about co-production acquisition rules to govern the acquisition and management of these properties through NeighborSpace board and staff. In terms of regulation, it gave them capacity to regulate not only their own organization, but also regulate these users through that intergovernmental agreement and the general capacities of the nonprofit. Acquiring land, I mean, that's the purpose of a nonprofit land trust. So if you look at the Land Trust Act, it says you can acquire land that meets public service requirements. Protect it long-term. Land trusts will protect them, quote, in perpetuity, which is supposed to mean forever. I think in reality, it's understood as like 100 years or something, but pollution remediation. Okay, so here's one where we see not well designed, just so you can see how this goes. Okay, so NeighborSpace as a nonprofit could be designed to test and alleviate soil pollution, which is a big problem. There's a lot of brownfields and that kind of thing. It has a generalized capacity for it. It could choose to do it, okay? And that's why it's at 0. You can't really tell. It's mixed. It wasn't mentioned in any of the documents that created it, the intergovernmental agreement. So it has this latent authority, but there was no formal assignment of responsibility. It was not intended to address this problem. Some other thing is supposed to address this problem. But in the interviews, when we talk to folks, they're like, man, that was a mistake. It would have been really good if it could do this, because we're in marginalized neighborhoods that have a really high capacity for, have a lot of these pollutions, and this is a barrier. Now, my critique as an institutional analyst is I would say, you need a different nonprofit to handle that, because this nonprofit is perfectly designed for what it's doing. And in order for it to take this on, could stretch it too far. And I think that from some informal conversations with folks was the rationale. It's too much. We're already handling this. We can't do that. So that gives you a general idea. I did my time. I want to turn it over to you all. I mean, I can go into other things. Oh yeah, there's one last thing. Sorry, this one's very important, and I'll turn it over. So transferring rights. The intergovernmental agreement explicitly says you are authorized to transfer these rights to communities, and you're required to do it. And the general nonprofit law for organizations allows them to do this too. And also the land trust law in Illinois explicitly states this as a capacity that these entities should have. Okay, so here's a quote directly from the ordinance. The Department of Planning and Development has recommended the formation of a nonprofit corporation to be known as NeighborSpace to own, lease, manage, or hold easements to typically small open spaces, blah, 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 for development and maintenance by neighborhood, community, and business groups, since such open space projects can be more efficiently managed by local groups and by government agencies. It's like a manifesto of state reinforcement. And then if you look at the bylaws, they reiterate that, and they actually say, we are accepting this premise and we are requiring that we do not self-govern these. They have to be governed by the community. Okay, that's where I'll end it there. Thank you. Wonderful. I plan to stop anyway.
Thank you. Very nice presentation. We have a question.
I just want to start with a quick clarification here. and
Yes,
it's probably
please do.
gonna be on the list later, but what do you mean by the distinction between authority and responsibility?
Yeah, okay, so authority is saying, well, I could actually bring up some examples if you want to see
Yeah,
the
we
code
will.
thing. Okay, let's do that.
The example you're given here, there wasn't really that much variation between.
Yeah,
Spreadsheet.
yes, please.
No, it's no problem.
Yeah, so in the other case I'm doing, tons of variation on these things.
Which one do you think?
Let's go to, let's see, which one will be the easiest? Let's go to the capacity worksheet. That'll probably be the best. Okay, now I can. Try to find an exact one if I can here. Page. Here we go. Okay, this is tiny, but it's enough for me to be able to explain to you. Okay, so when they set up the board, it said, and it actually used these terms. It said that in the intergovernmental agreement and the bylaws that the mayor, the park district, et cetera, were authorized to add 2 representatives each and a joint representative. And then, so for 7 total. And then the nonprofit group the non-governmental entity, president plus 3 others, so a minimum of 4. And then it says, that's the default representation. These, it says, is allowed or authorized to do it. That was kind of the language. And then it said, if you want to go beyond those minimums, then what NeighborSpace had to do is it has a requirement to report annually its income. And it has to show that if it wants to add more non-government actors, that it's actually funding itself beyond the initial funding of those government partners. So I forgot to say, they're each contributing $100,000. Okay, so if they get to $300,000 themselves, then they can add up to the amount to equate it. So they're 7 and 7, but they have to show proof of it, and they can do it then and only then. And if the funding falls back, they have to wait. They have to weight the weight of their votes accordingly to prorate it back down to the percentage it is. That's one teeny tiny example, but it's usually like they're saying, you have this power, or you have this requirement that you have to meet, essentially. That's one example. There's many, many examples. There's other ones like, okay, we're giving incorporators the authority to incorporate, to establish this thing. But if only eligible incorporators are allowed to be corporators, so that's a requirement. It's a responsibility that incorporators meet certain criteria. And if they, and another clause is, if these incorporators or someone acts and takes constitutional decision action, but isn't authorized, then there's consequences for that. So it's that kind of stuff.
Just a quick follow-up on that.
Yes.
So responsibility presumes that there's somebody out there monitoring what they're doing.
Yeah.
And who is that, and how does that sort of fit in?
Yes, you've got this polycentric system. Would you mind giving me back? Sorry to that. I can't be going in circles.
Okay. Yeah,
Yes,
this one here.
thank you. We need that kind of music in the old timey movies, like as we go through. Okay,
Think of entertainer on.
it's a polycentric system. There's a lot of enforcement
Yeah,
regulation going on. Okay, so in terms of nonprofit behaving like a nonprofit, Secretary of State, it says it evaluates this stuff, and if you're seen to be no longer acting like a tax exempt corporation, bad things will happen. In terms of the agreement, each of these is set up as enforcers of the agreement on NeighborSpace's administration, and that's in the intergovernmental agreement and the bylaws. In terms of evolving here, the partnership agreement is a major regulatory thing. It builds capacity for self-governance, where NeighborSpace forms an agreement with each of these community leadership groups. But in that, it has responsibilities for them and says, you need to do this, this, and this, or else we will revoke, your NeighborSpace status. Now, in interviews, they said they don't like to do that because then they're left with it.
Right.
So what they do instead is they use a lot of soft regulations. They have they develop, which is brilliant. It's just like Lynn's design principles, a conflict resolution process. It's up on our webpage. We coded that. So there's a lot of checks and balances here. I think that gives you.
Okay, thanks. That helps. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very, very interesting topic. One question that I have is around, there are non-profits with the people that is putting the money there, the government. Right? And in this case, in this system, how they work with the asymmetric power of people with the money in this kind of non-profit system usually take them.
Yeah, you caught on one of the principles that Bill Bloomquist helped me on quite a bit. When I first came up with these principles, I said external support from government, because I saw a lot of times what would happen is government would decentralize to some entity and say, here you go, here's the responsibility. Here's some of the authority, but we're not going to pay for that, essentially. So that stymies them. Or they'll say, here's a responsibility. Let me stack this decision board with all government representatives, and they're essentially just a pawn of the state. That's where the collective choice rules and the representation component comes in really important. So we were very careful to look at the board composition, the authority of who got to assign members to the board and what the restrictions and requirements were. So it's kind of interesting because you're right. The extent to which you have fiscal autonomy or not determines sort of the orientation a lot of times of that actor. So we have this term, which Adela helped me learn about for some other people: upward accountability, downward accountability, and horizontal accountability. horizontal accountability to your peers, upward to senior authorities or whatever, and downward to constituents. Okay, so the composition of the board, it has 2 representatives from each of these. So 2 from city appointed departments, and they have to have Greenspace experience. 2 from the park district and 2 from the forest preserve district. And then each of them jointly nominate 1 person as a balance among them. And then, so your question, I think, goes partly to that, but also to what's the balance of their interests versus NeighborSpace and the community interests. There is an alderman on there as a quasi-government, non-government representative to try to represent community interests. So that's kind of a check and balance. I actually think that could be improved more, in my opinion. I don't think that's enough, but they do a great job based off interviews. But and then the president there. Now, non-government representation, the more funding they get, like I said, that doesn't come from these, allows them to put more on the board, up to a total of 14. So it can actually be more governance control by them. In reality, it looks to be a little bit more weighted here. And it works out to be like 60-40 or somewhere around there. But what is interesting is all of these folks we asked, why did this get created? Do you know the history of it? Do you think it's working well? What's going well? What's not? And across the board, independently, they said, you remember what it caused this. We know the rationale for this. We believe in this cause. And you can see them weighing. It's like de Tocqueville's view of self-interest, rightly understood. The alderman especially was doing a great job of this, and the forest preserve district of demonstrating in their interviews was like, our department, we definitely have a goal. We want NeighborSpace, for example, to do more environmental education, but we recognize they got all this other stuff to do, and they were like balancing their needs against those things. So what I'm getting at is, I think through working together and having really solid communication, shared decision-making, et cetera, they did all the stuff you want a collective action process to do. They start to internalize each other's externalities and norms. And we're really had like a cooperative mentality to it, even as they pursued their own self-interest. So one last example, the alderman was talking about how there's a lot of times in his particular ward where folks would come up and they might not have the best interest of the Greenspace project in mind. They maybe don't have the right motives in trying to make a Greenspace. And he's like, it would be great for you to have it, but this doesn't meet the public good. It doesn't fulfill the cause. And he was talking explicitly about how it's difficult at times to balance his wards and self-interest against NeighborSpaces, but he was doing it. So.
Can I have a little
Yes.
follow-up around? In this case, the board of directors, actually the people can enter to these decision arenas are based on money. Right? And how about the communities that usually, if you're done in some kind of parts of the city where there is no money, how this could be in.
Okay, so you're hitting on, if I'm understanding correctly, one of the core problems of the dilemma. So high concentrations of poverty in the communities, really complex property law and other laws they have to deal with to try to resolve it. That's really difficult for these folks to do. A lot of times they don't have the money. You have to pay off the debts. You have to pay for insurance, et cetera. That's where NeighborSpace comes into play. NeighborSpace can have the land donated. Sometimes, especially in those cases, the land will be sold for like $1 or just donated. And they coordinate that through various programs they made in conjunction with other policies. So they'll say, okay, we have this property. These folks think they can really govern it. All right, let's make this easier on everybody and have this exchange. They also have written into their ordinances capacity for nonprofits and other organizations to waive existing debts, which is a huge thing. Nonprofits tax exempt on property, ownership, transactions, insurance discounts, et cetera. And then there's a lot of like volunteer production of, okay, they need some equipment, community comes together and does that. So basically it comes to this like self-sufficiency component that NeighborSpace as a nonprofit land trust is like really well designed to have. It just cuts costs across the board, transaction costs and financial. Yeah.
So we have Gustavo and then we have Brian online.
So first of all, I'm still struggling understanding how is this financed. So it's from the budget. So this is coming mainly from the budget of the city of Chicago?
Yeah, I think the budget of Chicago just hit like $1 trillion this year. And this is interesting, the city partners. Yeah. Yeah, and during this time, it was already really high or something like that. Anyway, at the beginning of the agreement in 1996, they all agreed to give 90,000 or whatever. And then after it worked for 2 years, like, oh, this is working, they agreed to give $100,000 a year, each of them from their budget, because in their mind, because we asked them, what are the perceived costs and benefits of this arrangement? Why are you still in this arrangement? And they basically said, you know, it's a very small amount of money for us to pay to get such a huge impact. I mean, it's tiny amount of money to get this much impact. So they're giving $300,000 primarily to ensure that the staff is there. And they're doing also other stuff to make it much cheaper and easier to get the property in the first place. Like I said, like they can literally just donate land to them at no cost. And then NeighborSpace has donors who say, I like what you're doing. They get fundraising, et cetera. When we did our interviews and we look at budget information, they said typically what's been happening annually is that they're bringing in like $200,000 to $400,000 per year from other sources. And one of those is impact fees. So the city space plan said, we have a lot of these urban developments. They're coming in, they're wiping out green space. Whenever someone has a development, a new development, they have to pay impact fees. Those fees go to NeighborSpace to get like 100,000, whatever. There's a limitation on that. It's not perfect, but so that's kind of.
Because my concern is like how much it costs this system on average an acre of green space, and then the comparison is to what? So because things are good or bad depending on what's the points of reference. No,
Yeah.
If you come and tell me, well, but it costs 5 times the usual cost through the equivalent of park and recreation, my evaluation of this program is very different. If you are telling me that it costs the same or it's got 1.2.
Okay, I'll give you
So
an
essentially,
I don't know the exact money breakdown, and I don't know it specifically Chicago. I know Louisville a little bit better, my other case study. So this is the kind of perverse trap that cities get in. They say, we're gonna wait for an angel developer to come in. It's gonna come in, it's gonna do some big sweeping development as it's gonna fix the problem, because we don't have tax base here, essentially. Okay, so we're gonna wait, and they will literally wait decades for these angel investors to go in. Okay, so what's happening in the meantime? Vacant property, vacant lots. What happens when there's crime on that? Police go out, has to be paid for. Building set on fire has to be paid for. Every year it has to be mowed over and over, et cetera. Huge maintenance costs. If I remember correctly, Louisville was paying $14 million a year just to maintain vacant properties that it owned, and it didn't own all of them. So you have all of that, and it has it in this land bank, trying to wait for it to be profitable and et cetera. So I don't know the exact numbers, but I can say across the board, they were all saying this is way more economically efficient than any other alternative we can think of. So, and that to me is the critical thing. It's working. They're adding year after year. So, but yeah, that's something so much. So the idea of this study is to do a broad level analysis of how did this come together? How's it functioning? And you could literally do a study on just authority applied to one thing or the fiscal component of one thing. But we didn't get to go into that level of depth.
Thank you. We have Brian online. We also have one from Dan Cole and then Angie.
Okay.
Brian, would you like to try to say your question, or otherwise I can?
Sure,
read it?
yeah, I also
Thank you.
put something in the chat.
Yeah.
As I'm
Hey, Brian.
outside.
This Brian.
there.
I noticed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Go
Really
for it.
neat case and really nice analysis in terms of state-supported self-governance. So I'm just going to encourage you, since you probably thought about already, to maybe say a bit more if we think about local public economies and polycentric governance in terms of either remediation or Louisville in terms of, okay, if the idea is not just to have one organization try and do everything, you know, what are ways of thinking about trying to have a diverse local public economy? Thanks.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I'll talk on that. So in the Louisville case, when I saw this case, I was doing these two cases in parallel. I was like, man, this template, this works pretty good. It's possible they could use this as a template and collective action around it and do something like it in Louisville. In Louisville, I have one of my PhD students, Abby Rudolph, is a specialist in community activism around urban agriculture and food in neighborhoods and that sort of thing, and has been trying to figure out how can we improve green space access for ownership, which is different than this model. This model does not solve ownership. and disenfranchisement of Black communities in that way. It solves usership and access. But anyway, we've been talking about how can we catalyze something like this? Can this happen in Louisville? And so we've tested some things out. We've tried talking with folks and everything. And what I've come to the conclusion of is we need to get our ducks in a row a little bit to better analyze, like get that analysis of their system and then come to each of these stakeholders, because I'm connected to a lot of them in different ways. She's connected much better to the community. And then I've been in talking with some other folks who have expertise in starting nonprofits and stuff to see like, can we have some cooperative process around just communication in the sense of like, so for example, and then I'll stop on that. Through sitting in on the meetings on both sides of these things or all sides of these, I see that they're in the classic dilemma. They're kind of each pointing the finger at each other and they don't see this bird eye view that actually you're all trapped in this dilemma and you all have things to add together. So I think that if we can bring them together and say, look, we analyze this, we see this is what you need, we see that's what you need, at least from our understanding, is this accurate? Why don't we talk about that? Is there a solution? And so, yeah, I think that'd be a great idea. And we're actually actively talking about studies to do that and processes to do that.
Thank you. Dan, would you like to say your comment out loud or should I go ahead, please?
And you're muted.
Unmute.
Yeah, it is. Oh, yeah, not muted, but still can't hear it.
We can read it out, Dan, if you'd like.
Let's read it. Yeah. Would you, Scott?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry.
Here, I can
Hey,
do it now. I switched microphones.
We got
Okay,
it.
cool. Great.
Yeah. So this is a really neat project, Dan, and I like it a lot. I'm wondering if it's worthwhile for you to look in at historical antecedents to this, because this kind of thing has been going on throughout history. The example I know of also from Chicago, in the late 19th century, a bunch of business leaders in Chicago put together a society for the prevention of smoke.
Interesting.
And this group published a report because they could afford to hire some experts. They actually handed out, created for citizens, some of these smoke cards to look at density of smoke that they could then to the city for some action. And they had a generally, at least a marginally beneficial impact on getting fellow businessmen to reduce levels of smoke pollution. And of course, as business leaders, they had political influence with the mayor and the city council. So these kinds of antecedents are out there, and I think that looking at how they worked or failed to work, because of course this was not a wildly successful effort, but marginally. It might tell us something about what's happening in your test cases.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. I have thought about it a little bit, but not thinking about, okay, analog public good provision or co-production around these things historically and how that might have maybe created capacity for this in some way. Yeah, that's interesting. One thing I'll say that is related to this is, so the Louisville case, one of the reasons we're interested in trying to catalyze things there is because in the Chicago case, we weren't able to access the framers. And so we couldn't get into our mind, like, why did you make such a progressive decision? Because so many other cities have this problem and they don't go this direction. So there's something else here that is making them have this judgment or catalyzing characteristics. And it could be things like learned throughout society there. Like, so for example, we did look at the Illinois Constitution, its Environmental Bill of Rights, which is pretty unique. Kentucky is only just now proposing constitutional amendment, adding a Bill of Rights. And it says that each individual has a right to a healthy environment, et cetera, et cetera. Those things are kind of mentioned in the background for why people should have green spaces and things. So thinking historically, like, where did that come from? Why did that emerge that way? Illinois is a front runner in creating the concept of nonprofits. A lot of places implement similar law based off what they see there. So there's something that seems to be kind of special maybe about Chicago historically. So that's a really cool, cool connection. Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar. There's no mayor's office, park district, forest preserve that I know that could pull this off. Including changing state law. I'm from Illinois. It's a train wreck. I mean, or it was a train wreck. A long time. They couldn't even form the University of Illinois for a while. So, you know, I'm intrigued what 6 champions sat somewhere to not only
Yeah.
this up, but moved something like this through the legislative body of the state of Illinois at a time when this makes no sense within the context of where the state of Illinois was at.
Yeah.
There's just got to be like 5 people whose names you've got to be mentioning or something along that
They're
line.
on city space. They're on the city space plan. Yeah.
Right? It's just, I mean, I'm from there. No way.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's a case that I have my students analyze in the class I teach about Memphis, Tennessee, and transformation of bicycling and green line and stuff. And what I'm noticing, so one of the things I notice is like there are other, again, context matters, is what you're kind of saying.
Yeah.
Historical context, et cetera. What I've often found in these situations is you will have a progressive mayor who's very favorable. And a lot of these interviewers that we talked to mentioned the specific mayor at that time, came up in most of those interviews. And actually, the current president at the time of NeighborSpace was from the Open Space Department of Planning, or I get the name wrong, from Chicago, who was assistant under the person who was another framer. So yeah, I think you're right. Now, I would push back to say it's not possible in other ones. It's difficult, is what I would say. It can be just like context creates a perfect storm. We talk about in resilience theory, windows of opportunity that open up through often crisis. So crisis started this. We see a lot of basins transformation occurring with really well-priced lawsuits that they will catalyze a window of opportunity. It can go different ways, but in this way, it went this certain way. So in any case, there's the Seattle Pea Patch program, has some analogous characteristics. There's Baltimore, I forget the name of it. I think they started Public Trust for Parks or something. So there are a lot of other places with sort of analogous things being just as productive. But they don't necessarily look exactly like this. They have combinations of things. So yeah, it's just like any other complex system. Sometimes they get it figured out, sometimes they don't. My goal is to say, how did this work? Can we start to do something intentional here? Well, if we want to be intentional, we need to know what actors need to have some capacities. And so it's sort of like putting it on the table and saying, we know these things are important. Maybe you all can work together and try to figure this out, how it's important or not, you know? But yeah.
You want an example of a train wreck?
Yeah.
The city of Bloomington is doing this right now with, I think they're calling it Hopewell. It's
Okay.
a hospital. And they've got it very wrong. And all of us are shouting how wrong they've gotten it. It's supposed to, in theory, look like this, but they've gotten multiple steps of this incorrect. And
It's a good observation.
it's gonna be right in the end.
Yeah.
Because you're right, there is a champion the champion doesn't know enough to know how dangerous he's behaving.
Yeah, how to do it properly. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not just, acquisition of property, it's
This is-
actually.
this is actually a good point.
Property without the
Yeah.
restriction of not turning it into a for-profit. There's no restriction on the disposal and everybody's like, oh, this is not gonna go well.
Interesting. This is a really good insight because it brings such another point that I didn't get to make. In my mind, imagine institutional archetypes, land trusts. Another one I'm studying is cooperative extension service. And there's other kinds of things. There's different types of land trusts. And each of those things has certain capacities, like a creature that's able to fit an ecosystem and do well in that and not be able to do other things. And if those institutional archetypes become common knowledge enough to where we understand their base capacities and say, we have this type of problem, it becomes easier in theory down the road to say, well, here's a collection of them that we know maybe could work instead of let's just invent from nothing or what did this other city do without understanding it. That's the vision I have here. That's why I said the institutional design principles are base elements. And I mean that literally like, well, figuratively, technically, but elements, chemical elements, periodic table of elements. You put the base elements together, they interact to make compounds. You put these base elements together, you get institutional capacities. And so I have a typology I can show you all. This should work. It should be at the end here, my appendix. Believe it or not, there's a lot of stuff I didn't show. Okay. Yeah.
7
Okay. So this is my base 3 typology for institutional archetypes classification system. Base 3, authority, responsibility, and operational resources. What I find is that if you can wrap your mind around the combination of those, it becomes easier to think about the other design principles interacting with them. Okay, so authority, higher, lower, high, and I'm talking about de jure right now. It can be informal, but I'm talking about de jure, so formal. Responsibility, lower, high. So if you had a system that's low in authority, official authority to do a thing, and low in responsibility, you get a quadrant that I'm sort of saying is this self-organized. You're thinking maybe quadrants, some of the stuff that Lynn was doing. So for example, in Greenspace systems that aren't governed well, a lot of times communities will say, there's this vacant lot that's been sitting here for 10 years. We're just going to squat on it and self-govern it. They don't have formal authority to do it. In fact, it's illegal. And they have no formal responsibility. Okay. So they end up in this quadrant, and depending on funding, you get different combinations of capacity for that. Now, NeighborSpace green spaces started out this way. It was designed originally to take existing green spaces that were informal and protect them through formalization and put them over in this quadrant, where now they have formal authority to be self-governing through the intergovernmental agreement and the powers of nonprofit, and they're required to do that. Okay, and then, so this is this sort of state reinforced sort of quadrant, not really quadrant, but down here. And then you can get into situations, common forms of deficiency. So imagine a situation where an entity is given responsibility and it's told, you have to do this. Okay, but then it doesn't have the appropriate authorities. This is very common. So I'll give you an example. In Louisville, Louisville tried to solve this exact same problem with a different institutional archetype, the Cooperative Extension Service. Now, one of the problems with the Cooperative Extension Service is that it is literally, according to its law, not allowed to own property for this reason, which means it does not solve the long-term maintenance of it. It doesn't reduce the price associated with it. And so when Louisville has tried to do that, they're only guaranteeing most of these places a year to use it. Okay, so no one's going to invest in that. That's not going to happen. It's the wrong creature for doing it. What it is good at is community engagement and training. And that's why they thought that would be a good fit. But it would be much better to have maybe a nonprofit land trust with the mission being assisted by the Extension Service to put in its capacity. So that's an example of how that can go.
So we have very little time.
Yes.
I have several methodological questions that we can talk about.
Okay.
But I'll give the last question to Jess.
Okay. That's a lot of yeah. I'll try to make them really brief. The question of Chicago always raises this interesting idea of, you know, internal machinery and the sort of pre-existing social networks that exist. And so one question I have is, how would you differentiate the extent to which this network structure emerged from pre-existing social relationships, a la the mayor,
Really good point.
from some other set of structural things that might matter? So that's the first. The second is, I love happy stories, but there's got to be some trade-offs here. Right? So what is it that they didn't get right, or what were some costs that, right? And then finally, is it the architectural, so you've been talking about institutional archetypes. The extension service versus what you've talked about here are in some ways a sort of gradation or sort of a level of granularity that we're not used to talking about when we talk about institutional archetypes. And so are these, you know, like I'm thinking, we briefly mentioned Bednar and Page, they're doing some work to think about institutional archetypes for particular kinds of problems. Michigan, I don't know if you think they're trying to think similarly, but a kind of at the, like, okay, if you want to allocate classes, if you want to allocate classes, it's a good idea to use markets. Probably not, right? So how do you think about kinds of problems you're trying to solve and what kinds of institutional archetypes you might use? But the granularity is significantly more abstract and potentially therefore less clear how you might apply it, right?
Yeah, that's why I didn't go that route.
It's an interesting kind of question. My first two are actual questions, the third.
Okay. I don't know if I can address all of them right now. I'm happy to do it after. I'll do my best. On the very last thing, since it's the simplest. So my behavioral theory of constitutional decision-making, it builds off of how do people perceive and value these design principles. and based off of culture, et cetera, how do they tend to put them together in different environments so that we have preferences over these things? So I believe I can eventually over time actually connect it from bottom up all the way up. And I already have some pretty good connections for that. I've got experiments I'm already running. Actually, I completed one. We just need to analyze the data and do models, et cetera. Yeah, because again, I came out of resilience theory originally on this, and they were sort of like, these things happen. And they're like, it's like, no, humans are in charge of some aspect of it. They're not total control, but they have some control. They're being intentional in some ways sometimes. Okay, trade-offs didn't get right. Well, you could argue they didn't get the pollution side of thing right. That's a really critical thing. That's a major barrier. They weren't built for that capacity and do a great job. Another thing, in terms of the costs and benefits, and I'm actually going to argue this is a strength, but it could be seen as a deficiency. There's not really strong explicit requirements to like equitably share finances and certain things. They're kind of it. So like in terms of representation on the board, it's like, okay, they can have equal based off of this funding to some extent, but they didn't think super comprehensively like, how are we going to ensure that this service provider, NeighborSpace, isn't getting overstretched and being asked to do too much? And so actually there's this back and forth in the interviews where all sides are basically like, we're not getting as much of this as we want. We want more environmental education from the Park Service, for example. NeighborSpace is like, we want them to back off. They want us to become an urban ag thing, and that's too much. So we're refusing to do it. To me, that's healthy because it's showing everybody's compromising, but everybody's still okay to keep going. So my mind is that it's designed well for that. There could be some other things we haven't, some of this stuff is still preliminary. I'm going to go through and see, but there was another one that I can't think of that is kind of a deficiency.
How about gentrification?
Good, yeah, gentrification. Now, it wasn't designed to solve that problem. And in fact, that is a major concern because what happens is these things develop really well and the property values go up and people say, man, that's really nice, and it gets enclosed. There is some protection of the space, but if you don't have that community there to manage it. So that's another thing is land ownership. So this is one that Abby really cares about because Black communities literally had their property taken away from them under blight and all this stuff they claim in the state's role and stuff in history. So she's not satisfied with either, right? She wants ownership. This doesn't solve that. So that's a little bit of like what problem are you solving? But okay, so background characteristics. One of these is structural, and you said things that are other than institutional. So
just think about the social, like, I know we're on,
Okay.
so we can chat later.
oh, sorry, I didn't realize. Okay,
Yeah, I sort of held.
okay, good. Well, then we can talk later.
Too short for a lot of conversation.
Yeah, thank you all.
Lunch so we can continue.
Yeah.
Really good, Daniel.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, very good.